August 30th, 1813, on the volatile edge of the American frontier, in the heart of the Mississippi Territory, a wooden stockade named Fort Mims became a charnel house. Within a few brutal hours, a bustling refuge of over 500 souls, settlers, allied Creek Indians, militiamen, and enslaved people, was reduced to ash and bone. 10 miles south at Fort Stoddert, Judge Harry Toulmin saw the ominous plumes of black smoke rising upstream. Within hours, his worst fears were confirmed as traumatized survivors arrived, bringing news of a terrible massacre. The story spread like wildfire, igniting panic across the frontier and a furious cry for vengeance that would echo through the halls of power. Remember Fort Mims. But this was not a simple, unprovoked attack born from savagery. The Fort Mims massacre was the bloody climax of a civil war, a war for the very soul of the Creek Nation. It was a conflict inflamed by relentless American expansion, fueled by spiritual prophecy, and ultimately triggered by a botched ambush in the Alabama wilderness. This is the story of how a nation tore itself apart, and how the flames of Fort Mims would forge a new, brutal American destiny, setting a Tennessee general named Andrew Jackson on an inexorable path to the presidency. The Creek Confederacy of the early 19th century was not a monolith. It was a complex society fractured by geography, ideology, and the encroaching influence of the United States. The lower Creeks, living closer to American settlements in Georgia, had increasingly adopted American ways. They embraced a market economy, cultivated large farms, and in some cases participated in the institution of chattel slavery, becoming known as one of the 5 civilized tribes. In stark contrast, the upper Creeks, residing in the more remote river valleys of Alabama, fiercely guarded their traditions. This faction, which would become known as the Red Sticks, viewed the American civilization program promoted by agents like Benjamin Hawkins as a poison that corrupted their culture and threatened their sovereignty. This profound internal division, a clash between assimilation and traditionalism, was the central fault line of the coming conflict. The primary driver of these tensions was the insatiable American hunger for land. The newly constructed Federal Road, a highway cutting through the heart of Creek territory, brought a flood of settlers, and a series of treaties had already stripped the Creek Nation of millions of acres. To the Red Sticks, every new farm, every new treaty, and every new road was an existential threat, pushing their world closer to the brink. In the fall of 1811, the great Shawnee war chief Tecumseh traveled south, bringing with him a powerful and revolutionary message. He envisioned a pan-Indian confederacy, a grand alliance of all tribes from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico to halt the American advance. He warned that to survive, all tribes must unite, cast off the contaminating ways of the white men, and drive the invaders back into the sea. Tecumseh's words were the spark that ignited the smoldering resentment of the upper Creeks, giving their anxieties a voice and a purpose. Inspired by Tecumseh and their own prophets who promised that the Master of Life would protect them in battle, the traditionalist faction took up the Red Stick of War, a favored weapon and a symbolic declaration of hostilities. Their fight was not just against the Americans. It was a civil war against the accommodationist lower Creeks, whom they saw as traitors to their heritage. The conflict began not with attacks on white settlements, but with raids on the farms and livestock of their assimilated brethren, a violent rejection of the new economic order they represented. The Creek Civil War was a war of identity, a profound struggle over the future of the Creek people. The dividing line was not blood, but culture and allegiance. This is powerfully illustrated by the conflict's key leaders, men of mixed heritage who found themselves on opposite sides of an ideological chasm. William Weatherford, known as Red Eagle, was a figure of immense complexity, of Scottish, French, and Creek ancestry. He was a wealthy planter and slaveholder who, by all economic measures, should have sided with the Americans. Yet his loyalty lay with his mother's powerful Wind clan and the traditionalist cause. He initially counseled for neutrality, but as American pressure mounted and the Red Stick movement grew, he felt compelled to join them, stating that they were his people, he was raised with them, and he would share their fate. His story is a tragic microcosm of the choices forced upon individuals caught between two worlds. On the other side stood Captain Dixon Bailey. Also of mixed heritage, Bailey was a native of the Creek town of Latency who had been educated in Philadelphia. He fully embraced an American identity, becoming a captain in the Mississippi Territorial Militia and a staunch U.S. ally. He was considered a bitter personal enemy of Weatherford, and his presence commanding militia at both Burnt Corn and Fort Mims underscores the deeply personal and internecine nature of the war. The fact that two men of such similar backgrounds could become mortal enemies reveals the true nature of the conflict. It was a battle for the soul of the Creek Nation itself. The event that would directly precipitate the horror at Fort Mims was a small, chaotic skirmish that occurred a month earlier. It was an American-initiated attack that proved to be a strategic catastrophe, transforming the Civil War into a direct war against the United States and providing the Red Sticks with a powerful motive for revenge. In July 1813, the Creek leader Peter McQueen led a party of warriors to Pensacola, then part of Spanish Florida. Their mission was to acquire modern arms and ammunition. This journey highlights the international context of the Creek War, which was deeply intertwined with the larger War of 1812. The Spanish and their British allies had a shared interest in checking American expansion and were willing to supply native factions to achieve that goal. After receiving a friendly present of gunpowder and lead from the Spanish governor, McQueen's party began the trek back to their villages, their pack horses laden with the vital supplies needed for the coming war. American officials learning of the Pensacola mission moved to intercept the Red Sticks. Colonel James Caller, a senior officer of the Mississippi Territorial Militia, hastily assembled a force of about 180 men. His command was a motley collection of white settlers and allied Creeks, including companies led by the famed frontiersman Samuel Dale and Captain Dixon Bailey. On July 27, 1813, Caller's force achieved complete surprise. They discovered McQueen's party resting during their noon meal along the banks of Burnt Corn Creek and launched an immediate attack. The initial charge scattered the Red Stick warriors, who abandoned their camp and fled into the cover of a nearby swamp. Believing they had won a swift and easy victory, the American militia's discipline completely collapsed. A majority of the men broke formation and descended upon the Red Stick camp, consumed with looting the pack horses and supplies. From the swamp, McQueen and his warriors watched the chaos unfold. They regrouped and launched a furious counterattack on the disorganized and distracted Americans. The surprise was now reversed. Panic seized the militia. Two-thirds of Caller's command abandoned the fight and fled in what was later described as a disgraceful rout. Only a small contingent of about 80 men, led by Dale, Bailey, and a few other officers, stood their ground before they too were overwhelmed and forced to retreat. The Battle of Burnt Corn was a decisive Red Stick victory and a profound humiliation for the territorial militia, but its true significance lay in its consequences. In the eyes of the Red Sticks, who did not yet consider themselves at war with the United States, this was an unprovoked attack. The ambush, the attempted theft of their supplies, and the deaths of their warriors transformed simmering hostility into a burning desire for vengeance. This singular event shifted the Red Sticks' focus from their internal civil war to a direct conflict with the Americans who had attacked them. Their target for retribution would be Fort Mims, a place where many of the Burnt Corn militiamen and their families had taken refuge. The massacre at Fort Mims was not simply an act of aggression. It was the direct outcome of a chain reaction of failures. The inability of the Creek Nation to resolve its internal divisions, The strategic blunder of the American militia at Burnt Corn and the catastrophic failure of command at the fort itself created a perfect storm of cultural conflict, military incompetence, and a breakdown of discipline that culminated in one of the bloodiest days on the American frontier. Fort Mims was not a military installation, but a fortified plantation stockade hastily erected around the home of a wealthy settler named Samuel Mims. By late August 1813, it was dangerously overcrowded, packed with over 500 settlers, Allied Creek Indians, militiamen, and enslaved people seeking refuge from the escalating violence. The fort's commander, Major Daniel Beasley of the Mississippi Volunteers, was tragically unfit for his post. He was reportedly drunk on the day of the attack and demonstrated a staggering degree.
The fort's commander, Major Daniel Beasley of the Mississippi Volunteers, was tragically unfit for his post. He was reportedly drunk on the day of the attack and demonstrated a staggering degree of negligence. He dismissed multiple credible warnings of a large Red Stick force in the area. When two enslaved men tending cattle reported seeing painted warriors, Beasley had one of them flogged for raising a false alarm. Most critically, he allowed the fort's main eastern gate to be blocked open by a sand drift, creating an open invitation for an attack. At noon, as a drum called the fort's unsuspecting inhabitants to their midday meal, the Red Stick force of 700 to 1,000 warriors, led by William Weatherford and Peter McQueen, emerged from the cover of a nearby ravine. They charged across an open field and stormed through the undefended gate. Major Beasley was among the first to die, cut down by a war club as he tried desperately to force the jammed gate shut. The attackers poured into the fort's outer enclosure, seizing the gun loopholes in the stockade walls and firing upon the panicked defenders within. Captain Dixon Bailey managed to rally the militia and settlers, who mounted a fierce hours-long defense from the inner enclosure and the various buildings inside the fort. The fighting was brutal and at close quarters. After hours of being held at bay, the Red Sticks resorted to a terrifyingly effective tactic. They began shooting flaming arrows onto the wooden roofs of the buildings. The fort was transformed into an inferno, forcing the defenders out from their cover and into the open, where they were cut down. As the organized defense collapsed, the battle devolved into a horrific massacre. The Red Stick warriors, enraged by their own losses and fueled by a thirst for vengeance after Burnt Corn, began killing indiscriminately, men, women, and children alike. Multiple accounts, including Weatherford's own later statements to Andrew Jackson, suggest he was horrified by the turn of events. He reportedly tried to stop the slaughter of non-combatants, only to be threatened with death by his own warriors, who were consumed by a killing frenzy. He later lamented, "My warriors were like famished wolves, and the first taste of blood made their appetites insatiable." This presents a complex portrait of a leader who helped unleash a fury he could not control. Only a small number of the fort's inhabitants, estimates range from 30 to 50, managed to escape the carnage. Most of the enslaved African Americans were spared from death, only to be taken captive by the Red Sticks. The few survivor accounts that exist paint a chilling picture of the chaos. The enslaved woman Hester, though shot in the breast, escaped in a canoe and was the first to bring the news to General Ferdinand Claiborne. Another survivor, Zachariah McGirth, later learned that his wife and daughters had been saved by a Red Stick warrior named Sonoda, whom the family had once taken in as a hungry, orphaned boy. These small acts of humanity were rare exceptions on a day defined by overwhelming brutality. The news of the massacre at Fort Mims sent a shockwave of terror across the American South. Settlers abandoned their homesteads and fled to fortified posts, demanding government action and swift retribution. In American newspapers and political speeches, the event was stripped of its complex context. It was not portrayed as a battle in a Creek Civil War that Americans had stumbled into, but as a savage, unprovoked massacre of innocent white men, women, and children. This powerful and simplified narrative galvanized the American public and created an overwhelming political mandate for a full-scale war to crush the Creek Nation. The cry, "Remember Fort Mims," became a powerful propaganda tool, justifying a war of conquest by framing it as a righteous crusade of civilization against savagery. The massacre provided the political cover for a massive military intervention. The governments of Tennessee, Georgia, and the Mississippi Territory immediately mobilized their militias to invade Creek lands. The primary force, an army of Tennessee volunteers, was placed under the command of Major General Andrew Jackson. The Creek War would be the crucible that forged his national reputation. His ruthless and effective campaign against the Red Sticks would catapult him from a regional figure to a national hero, setting him on a direct path to the White House. Jackson's campaign was relentless and brutal. It culminated on March 27, 1814, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. There, Jackson's army of 3,300 men, which included U.S. regulars, militia, and some 600 allied Cherokee and Lower Creek warriors, trapped 1,000 Red Stick warriors in a fortified bend of the Tallapoosa River. The ensuing battle was a slaughter. Over 800 Red Stick warriors were killed, making it one of the deadliest single battles in the history of American Indian warfare. In the aftermath of this devastating defeat, a defiant William Weatherford rode alone into Jackson's camp. He did not come to beg for his own life, but to surrender on behalf of his people and to plead for food for the starving Creek women and children hiding in the woods. His famous speech to Jackson, "I am in your power, do with me what you please. My people are all gone. I can do no more than weep over the misfortunes of my nation," deeply impressed the American general with its courage. Jackson, recognizing a fellow warrior, spared his life. The war officially ended on August 9, 1814. At Fort Jackson, Andrew Jackson forced the leaders of the Creek Nation, including his own Lower Creek allies who had fought alongside him, to sign a punitive treaty. Arguing that the entire nation was responsible for the actions of the Red Sticks, he forced them to cede 23 million acres of their ancestral land to the United States. The war that began as an internal Creek struggle over identity and tradition ended with the dispossession of the entire nation, a direct result of the political opportunity the Fort Mims massacre provided for American expansionists. The Fort Mims massacre was more than a battle. It was a point of no return on the southern frontier. It transformed a regional civil war into a national campaign of conquest, providing the moral and political justification for the United States to break the power of the Creek Nation. The event set a grim precedent, accelerating the policy of Indian removal that in the 1830s would lead to the Trail of Tears for the Creeks and the other southeastern tribes, who were forcibly exiled from their homelands. The ashes of Fort Mims fertilized the soil for the future American states of Alabama and Mississippi. The blood shed there launched the political career of Andrew Jackson, a man who would come to redefine the American presidency and its relationship with Native peoples. The echoes of that terrible day on the Alabama frontier still reverberate through American history, a brutal reminder of the complex, bloody, and often forgotten conflicts that shaped the nation.